Hi, in order to better prepare you for the French Revolution test, I wanted to create some extended learning opportunities where you could watch tutorials that'll walk you through each of the stages of the revolution. I know that political theory can be difficult, and when we talk about this in class, some of you have been struggling with these concepts. So, this video is meant to provide you with extended understanding. And obviously, any questions that come from this, you can go ahead and email me or come talk to me personally. So, we've been talking through the first stage of the French Revolution, which is known as the Reform stage. In this stage, the French people had decided that the status quo, now we've used this word a lot, but I just want to clarify what status quo means. When we're talking political or government, status quo means it's the accepted government that's in place. People accept that form of government. It's the way that the government has always been run. So before the French Revolution, the status quo, the government in place, was the absolute monarchy and the three estates that existed in France. The first estate being the clergy, the second being the nobility, and the third being everybody else, bourgeoisie, artisans, rural peasants, city workers, etc. The form of legislature that they had, if they ever met, was the Estates General, which is the meeting of all three estates. Now, prior to the Revolution, it hadn't met since the 1600s, and it was not called again until the late 1700s. So even though the Estates General was in principle, it actually was never really put into practice. The government really in place was an absolute monarchy with Louis XVI as the monarch in place. Now, we talk about the start of the revolution and all the factors that led to it, and that led to stage one. Stage one has the word reform in it. Reform means to change, but not to completely change the government altogether. It means instead to change some of the parts of the government that were considered unfair and corrupt, and to make the system better for more of the French people. The first stage of the revolution was really inspired by the liberals. So, looking at your political spectrum on page 3 of your cycle revolution, you're going to notice that the liberals favor some changes in policy, but they're willing to work with the existing government and only change what is considered, like I said, corrupt or unfair. So, if we were to go to our revolution cycle, you're going to notice that we start up here with the status quo, which is our absolute monarch, and we're going to work our way around this circle through the first stage, leading to our next status quo. The status quo that they wanted at the end of cycle one was to form a constitutional monarchy, which meant that, and it's defined for you here, the king has limited powers, and they would develop three branches of government, the executive, legislative, and judicial, that would create more opportunities for some of French citizens. Now, it doesn't mean all. In fact, the constitution set up under this would actually favor wealthy property owners, but it was a step away from an absolute authority. The other thing that they did during this stage was they worked to reform the practices of nobility and the church as well. So everything in this stage is working towards a new status quo with a shift of a government that is more people would be involved in the makeup of that government. The king's powers would be limited really extensively. And really, it would go to the idea of a constitutional government where the people, certain groups of people, would have greater control. And it wasn't based on a system of nobility or church or a monarchy completely any longer. So when I ask you, how does this stage, what is the new status quo that the stage one was trying to reach? The answer is a constitutional monarchy. Now, if we look at our cycle of revolution, we're going to notice that the status quo is what they achieved, but there comes a decision point that forces the people into the next stage of the revolution, which is stage two, or the radical stage. That decision point comes when Louis, who had been agreeing openly to the Constitution, secretly, though, behind the backs of the National Assembly and the national groups that were meeting, secretly was meeting with emigres and other outside foreign leaders to overthrow this government and try to get back some of his power. When he realizes that he can't do it within his country, Louis decides to escape with his family in 1791, with him, his wife, and his children, and unfortunately is caught. He is not able to make it out of the country. And when Louis's escape plan comes to public knowledge, the people can no longer feel like they trust the king and they turn against him. So that ultimately ends stage one, because what they realize is that their monarch is not willing to work with this new status quo. So instead, they have to come up with a new idea of what to do. And that's going to lead us through stage two, which we're getting into. One of the other questions that I asked you was, what are some of the major events that could back up the idea of this reform stage. So below, I've listed a bunch of items that we've talked about that happen over the course of stage 1 that show the growth of this constitutional monarchy that was the plan. The first is the tennis court oath and the formation of the National Assembly. The idea that they want to form a government that is for the people, and they take an oath that they're not going to stop meeting to do so. Then we have the storming of the Bastille. This has a little taste of radicalism in it because we see the cutting of the heads, the pikes, and the parading. But the storming of the Bastille, you could see for the people, is to take down the old structure, the Bastille, which was the representation of imprisonment and torture, and to try to form something different. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, which we've looked at, kind of listing the major principles that the Enlightenment inspired of the rights and beliefs of what the citizens of France should have, a very progressive document, and really laid out a plan for what are the ideas. Remember, though, a declaration is not a law code. It's simply a declaration of what they want the rights to be. And it very much is like a Bill of Rights, but it has to be attached to the Constitution in order to come into effect. We also see the civil constitution of the clergy, which was the limiting of the church's power. The law stated that the parishes and dioceses would elect their own clergy. They seized church property. The government decided that they would pay the salaries of priests and the bishops. So this really was going to limit the power of the first estate, which we talked about in the old regime, how extensively powerful this estate was. So it's kind of reforming, once again, coming to that word, changing the powers in this new formation of government. And finally, the Constitution of 1791, which was going to limit the power of the king. It would actually divide the government into 3 branches, very much influenced by Montesquieu and the creation of the American government. It would become a legislative assembly. It would have voting practices. Not everybody could vote, but it was extensively more people could vote than under the old regime. So once again, we see that the status quo goal for stage 1 was constitutional monarchy. If you look at the revolution cycle again, had they accepted the status quo, had Louis not broken the people's trust, the revolution would have ended at this stage and they would have formulated their new government. There may have been radical actions taken that we could find and still continue our cycle of revolution, but it would not go to the extents that we're looking at. It's when Louis decides to escape with his family that makes the new decision point that really pushes us into stage 2, which is known as the radical stage, or the reign of, where we find Robespierre power growing, the Republic of Virtue, and the Reign of Terror. I hope this helps. Please let me know if you have any questions. And once again, this is meant to be a tutorial to help you prepare for the test. Good luck.